It's almost impossible to comprehend the scale of what Hitler unleashed in the summer of 1941. Operation Barbarossa, his bold and catastrophic invasion of Stalin's Soviet Union, began at dawn on June 22nd from the forests of occupied Poland. 3.8 million German and Axis soldiers surged eastward like a steel tide. Tanks rolled through the mist, aircraft screamed overhead, and entire cities vanished beneath the thunder of the Nazi war machine. For weeks it seemed unstoppable. Village after village, mile after mile, fell under German control. Hundreds of thousands of square miles were consumed in fire and chaos. Behind the front lines, Nazi ideology worked like a poison, cleansing the land of those deemed unworthy, preparing it to feed and fuel a new empire. By autumn, the spearhead of this massive force Army Group Center, commanded by Fedor von Bock, pushed so close to Moscow that the Soviet capital could almost be seen through the haze of snow and smoke. Victory appeared inevitable. But destiny had other plans. The German command had misjudged the vastness of the land they sought to conquer. Their lifelines, fuel, food, and ammunition stretched thin across endless miles of frozen mud. Engines faltered, supplies vanished, soldiers starved, and as their momentum broke, the unstoppable tide began to slow again and again, until it stood still against the endless expanse of Russia. The German advance, once unstoppable, began to stagger. Each mile gained came at a greater cost, and in that fleeting pause, the Soviets found their breath from the ashes of retreat. They began to organize, building lines of defense, gathering strength, and preparing for the counterstroke that would change history. But it wasn't strategy alone that saved Moscow. It was nature itself. The Russian winter arrived like a living curse, savage, merciless, and absolute. Temperatures plunged, rivers froze solid, and entire divisions were trapped in seas of snow. Engines cracked in the cold, weapons jammed, and frostbite claimed more soldiers than bullets ever could. The war froze in place. For months, the Eastern Front became a graveyard of silence and ice. But when spring returned in 1942, the frozen earth thawed, and with it, Hitler's ambition reignited. The High Command had learned nothing from the suffering their hunger for conquest remained, but now another hunger gnawed at them far deeper. Oil, the lifeblood of the Nazi war machine, was running dry. Without fuel, their tanks were worthless, their aircraft grounded. So they planned a new offensive, one that would both feed their engines and starve the Soviets of theirs. And at the heart of that plan lay a city rising on the banks of the mighty Volga River. Once known as Tsaritsyn, it had been renamed in honor of the man leading the Soviet Union himself, Stalingrad, before the war. Few had even heard its name, but soon the world would never forget it. For in that quiet industrial city, two giants would collide, their armies, their leaders, their nations, and neither would yield. This is the story of Stalingrad. Welcome to Wars of the World. Within Nazi Germany, a society built on obedience, conformity, and fear, there still existed an obsession with heroes. The regime demanded loyalty, yet worshipped the few who stood out as symbols of its ideals. Those who excelled in service to the Führer were lifted above ordinary soldiers, praised as living proof of the Nazi dream. But for these so-called heroes, glory came with a curse. They had to prove themselves worthy of it every single day. In the Wehrmacht, that meant showing no hesitation, no mercy, no doubt, only devotion to the cause and to conquest. And in Hitler's twisted ideology, the enemy took many forms. A Soviet soldier defending his homeland, a partisan armed with a crowbar, a frightened Jewish mother holding her child to the Nazi mind. They were all the same, targets to be erased, obstacles to the vision of a pure empire. Among the armies of the Reich, one unit stood as both legend and monster, the 6th Army. Serving under Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau, it was forged on October 10, 1939, a vast mechanized force of 285,000 men, tanks, and heavy guns. They had stormed across France, Belgium, and the Low Countries during the Blitzkrieg, earning medals, songs, and fear in equal measure. They became Hitler's pride, the shining blade of his army. But behind that reputation hid something far darker. Wherever the 6th Army advanced, death followed. Villages burned. Civilians vanished. Under Reichenau's orders, and sometimes by their own cruel initiative, soldiers took part in atrocities beyond counting: executions, mass shootings, and purges of anyone deemed unworthy. Even when the guns fell silent, the killing continued. The 6th Army had become a legend not of honor, but of horror. Hitler had made a dark promise, a decree that would stain the conscience of his army forever. He swore that no German soldier would ever face punishment for actions taken against the Bolsheviks. In the twisted logic of the Reich, this was not permission, it was a license to kill. For many in the 6th Army, it meant the freedom to slaughter at will, to murder for the most trivial of reasons, to act without fear or guilt. The Eastern Front had already been a land of misery, frozen and blood-soaked. Now it was also a land where cruelty was not just allowed, it was expected. By the end of 1941, Army Group South had endured a brutal winter that tested even the strongest will. The cold was merciless, biting through flesh and steel alike. And in January 1942, the 6th Army's fiery commander, Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau, met his end not in battle, but in the cold grip of fate. It was January 12th. Temperatures plunged far below freezing, as von Reichenau, stubborn and proud, decided to combat the chill with a morning run. Later that day, while dining with his officers, his color drained. He staggered, clutching his chest. A heart attack struck him down in seconds. Hitler, upon hearing the news, ordered his immediate evacuation to Berlin. Still unconscious, von Reichenau was strapped upright into an armchair and placed aboard a Dornier Do 17 bomber. But fate had one last cruelty to deliver. As the aircraft descended to refuel in Lemberg, eastern Ukraine, it crashed, killing the 6th Army's commander instantly. The Iron General was gone. Yet, before death claimed him, von Reichenau had made one final decisive act. He had chosen a successor. General Friedrich Paulus Paulus was no ordinary officer. A veteran of the First World War, he had fought alongside men like Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox. But unlike Rommel, Paulus was no daring battlefield hero. He was a planner, cautious, methodical, meticulous. His men found him distant, even cold. But history would reveal something rare about him, a sense of humanity. Where other commanders saw soldiers as expendable tools of war, Paulus saw men flesh, spirit, and morale. He understood that victory depended not only on orders and guns, but on the hearts of those who followed them. After the fall of France, General Friedrich Paulus was reassigned to Berlin, not to the battlefield, but to the war rooms, where strategy replaced bullets and blueprints replaced bloodshed. There, he helped craft the grand design for Army Group South's invasion of the Soviet Union. His analytical mind and meticulous nature caught the approving eye of Field Marshal von Reichenau, who would later mark him as his chosen successor. Yet when Paulus officially took command of the 6th Army, the decision stirred quiet controversy among his peers. Many saw him as too cautious, too academic, and perhaps most dangerously in Hitler's world, not fanatical enough. Unlike his predecessor, Paulus did not share the same blind devotion to Nazi ideology. In fact, he reversed several of von Reichenau's brutal orders, particularly those involving the inhuman treatment of Soviet civilians. He forbade his soldiers from launching unauthorized cleansing operations, acts of mass murder that had become routine across the Eastern Front. Still, reality was not clean-cut. Under pressure from Berlin and the ever-present SS, Paulus assigned limited units to assist Heinrich Himmler's death squads, who roamed behind the lines in their ghastly missions of extermination. It was a compromise, one that would haunt his legacy. For now, his immediate mission was clear: to hold the line through the remainder of the savage Russian winter and prepare his army for the coming spring. But fate had other plans. On May 12, 1942, before Paulus could go on the offensive, the Soviets struck first. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko launched a ferocious assault near Kharkov, catching the 6th Army off guard. For 3 relentless days, Paulus's forces fought desperate holding actions. The snow was melting into mud, and the ground itself seemed to bleed as men clashed in brutal, close-quarters combat. The Germans reeled, but they did not break. Then, from above, salvation came screaming through the skies. The Luftwaffe seized air superiority, tearing through the Red Air Force and hammering Timoshenko's advancing divisions with precision airstrikes. By May 17th, the tide had turned. From the south, the 1st Panzer Army surged forward, slicing into Soviet flanks. 2 days later, Paulus unleashed his 6th Army from the north. The jaws of a perfect pincer movement closed steel meeting steel, trapping Timoshenko's forces in a deadly cauldron. In the end, the Soviet disaster was staggering. Over 270,000 men killed, captured, or missing. An entire army erased. German casualties, by contrast, were fewer than 30,000. The Battle of Kharkov was a triumph of German precision and speed, a return to the glory days of Blitzkrieg. Flush with victory, Paulus turned once again to his preparations. The next campaign would be even greater and infinitely more dangerous. Across the map tables of Berlin, Hitler was already planning his next grand offensive. The war in the East would reignite with a vengeance. The objective? To strike deep into the Soviet heartland once more, reclaim the initiative, and seize the oil that would fuel the Nazi war machine. The stage was being set for Operation Blue, the campaign that would lead the 6th Army straight into the inferno of Stalingrad. One of Hitler's most ambitious objectives in the renewed Eastern Campaign was nothing less than the capture of the Soviet Union's oil heartland, the Caucasus region, surrounding the city of Baku in present-day Azerbaijan. This was not merely a strategic move, it was a matter of survival. For the Nazi war machine, Germany's tanks, planes, and mechanized divisions were starving for fuel. Capturing the Baku oil fields would not only feed this insatiable engine of war, but also cripple Stalin's forces, as the region supplied an astounding 80% of all Soviet oil. The mission was codenamed Fall Blau Case Blue, a name that would soon be etched in the annals of military history. To lead the operation, Hitler reinstated Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, the same commander who had nearly captured Moscow a year earlier. Now, he was offered a second chance and a promise of redemption in Hitler's eyes. But even success on the battlefield would not be enough. Capturing the oil was only the beginning. The true challenge lay in transporting it back to the German heartland. For this monumental task, Hitler assembled specialized oil brigades from Romania, experts in extraction and logistics. Their mission: to build pipelines across the conquered Soviet soil, restore the captured oil fields, and feed the lifeblood of war directly into the Reich's veins. Yet, Oil was not the only obsession driving Case Blue. Deep in the corridors of Nazi ideology, a darker vision was unfolding. Germany's empire was expanding, and with Allied bombings threatening its supply chains, food shortages loomed ominously on the horizon. Just 2 days before Operation Barbarossa had begun, Nazi theorist Alfred Rosenberg, one of the regime's chief architects of conquest, had presented a chilling doctrine. He argued that for Germany to endure to dominate, it must seize not only oil, but also the fertile farmlands of the southwestern Soviet Union. In his words, this territory would become the breadbasket of Nazi Germany. So, as German tanks roared eastward under the blazing summer sun, their orders were clear: not just to fight, but to feed an empire, to fuel a dream, and to bleed a continent dry in pursuit of power. It's almost unbelievable now, knowing what destiny awaited them, but at this early stage, Stalingrad was not meant to be a grand prize. In the summer of 1942, the city that bore Joseph Stalin's own name wasn't seen as strategically essential. The goal was practical, not symbolic. Cripple its factories, halt its war production, and distract Soviet forces long enough for Germany's southern drive toward the Caucasus oil fields to succeed. The plan was to bombard Stalingrad, disrupt its railways and river routes, and choke the lifelines connecting the Soviet armies in the north and south. But as the blueprints of Operation Case Blue unfolded, something began to change inside Hitler's mind. The more he thought about it, the more the name Stalingrad burned like an obsession. The propaganda value became irresistible. To raise the swastika above a city named after his greatest enemy would be the ultimate insult, a psychological strike against Stalin himself. What began as a secondary objective was about to become a personal mission, one that would shape the fate of millions. Yet beneath this ambition, German commanders saw danger looming. The proposed front stretched over 1,000 miles, an enormous line for the already overextended Wehrmacht to sustain. Supplies were thin, fuel was scarcer than ever, and the logistical arteries of the German army were collapsing under their own weight. They knew too well what overreach could mean. The Soviets were masters of patience. They could wait, find the weakest point, and strike like a blade in the dark. One well-timed counteroffensive could split the German line and trap entire divisions, just as the Germans themselves had done to the Soviets at Kharkov months earlier. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, experienced and sharp, voiced his concerns bluntly. He distrusted the plan not for its ambition, but for its execution. The flanks of the German advance would be held not by the Wehrmacht's best, but by Romanian and Hungarian divisions, men far less trained, less equipped, and far less committed to the Nazi cause to compensate. The German High Command placed its faith in the Luftwaffe, particularly Luftflotte 4, the Fourth Air Fleet. It was tasked with everything air superiority, bombardment, reconnaissance, and even supply drops. If the front stretched too thin, the sky would have to carry the burden. It was a gamble built on pride, desperation, and overconfidence. And as history would prove, it was a gamble that would soon consume them all. Above the frozen plains, the sky was meant to be Germany's shield. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin but proud, shouldered a vast burden to beat back Soviet aircraft, to blind and break rail and river lifelines, and to rain destruction where the ground could not. Though the Red Air Force often outnumbered them, Soviet pilots flew under a rigid command and clumsy tactics that blunted their edge. The German air crews, led by veterans with hard faces and steady hands, believed themselves superior, yet fatigue had already begun to hollow their strength. Months of relentless sorties had worn engines thin and men thinner still. Still, when Case Blue opened, more than 1,500 German aircraft waited on the tarmac, engines humming like a restless swarm. The plan carved the front into two decisive axes. In the north, forces were to secure the banks of the Don and push toward the Volga, isolating the industrial heartland. In the south, spearheads would drive into the Caucasus for oil. Between these thrusts, the 6th Army Paulus' command would move against Stalingrad, aimed at severing the Soviets' north-south lines of communication and crushing the railway and river routes that bound the Red Army together. Confidence ran high, but the scheme had exposed seams. To hold a front stretching over 1,000 miles, the Wehrmacht needed more than German arms. It needed faithful allies to hold the flanks. Romania and Hungary were called to that task, divisions less well-equipped, less trained, and often less committed than their German counterparts. Commanders warned that such thin coverage could invite disaster. A single sharp Soviet thrust through a weak flank might cleave the line and trap entire corps. To mask that risk, Berlin placed enormous faith in the air. Luftflotte 4 would be the glue and the hammer, providing close air support, closing gaps, and even flying supplies when roads failed. Air power was meant to be the safety net that would catch any breach and the fist that would crush any counterstroke. Yet war is a fragile choreography, and one broken link can topple the whole. In a flash of human error and military habit, General Gerd von Rundstedt's subordinate, acting against Hitler's strict censorship of the plans, shared the outline of the offensive with his division commanders. Tradition argued for shared knowledge so the machine might keep working even if leaders fell. That decision, meant to bolster continuity, became a lever of catastrophe. When a downed German officer fell into Soviet hands, the enemy did not find a lone scrap of paper. They discovered an instruction, maps, unit dispositions, and annotated routes toward the Volga and the Caucasus. On the eve of the Great Push, the Soviets were handed the Reich's intentions on a silver platter. For the first time that summer, advantage slipped. The sky could not hide what men had foolishly exposed on the ground. The gamble had a crack, and history was already beginning to widen it. The discovery of the leaked plans sent shockwaves through the German high command. Panic spread like wildfire. General Stumme, whose decision had handed the Soviets the Reich's most guarded secret, was immediately recalled to Berlin. There, he faced the unrestrained fury of Adolf Hitler himself. The Führer demanded nothing less than a court-martial for this blatant breach of discipline. Only the desperate intervention of powerful allies, including Hermann Göring, saved Stumme from imprisonment or execution. But his reprieve came with a cruel twist of fate. He was reassigned to replace Rommel as commander of the Africa Corps. Just as that front was collapsing, his new command would become his tomb. On October 24, 1942, near El Alamein, British troops opened fire on a German staff car moving too close to their lines. Inside was Stumme. His driver fled. The general's lifeless body was found by the enemy, marking the end of a man whose single act had already reshaped history. Meanwhile, preparations for Case Blue pressed forward. Officers whispered in anxious tones, now that the Soviets knew their objectives, what counterstroke would Stalin make? But fate, or rather Stalin's paranoia, came to their rescue. The Soviet leader refused to believe the captured plans were genuine. In his mind, no German officer could have been so careless. He saw it as a trap, a brilliant ruse designed to trick him into weakening Moscow's defenses. Convinced that Hitler's real goal was still the Soviet capital, Stalin dismissed the intelligence entirely. He was wrong. In reality, Hitler had ordered the opposite. The Moscow front was to hold position, while powerful divisions were shifted south to seize the Caucasus oil fields and crush Stalingrad. As June approached, the German logistical machine roared to life. Rail lines groaned under endless convoys of tanks, half-tracks, artillery, and ammunition. Moving eastward, supply officers worked without rest, knowing that fuel, food, and spare parts would again decide victory or ruin. Despite their doubts, commanders placed their faith once more in Hitler, the man who had not yet failed them. Then came June 28, 1942. The skies trembled with the sound of engines. The 4th Panzer Army, led by the formidable General Hermann Hoth, surged forward, spearheaded by thunderous waves of close air support from Luftflotte, for the offensive had begun. The Soviets, wary of encirclement after countless bloody lessons, chose to fall back rather than stand and die. But their retreat was chaotic, a crumbling line, Under the relentless hammer of German armor and air power, Alexander Lura's bombers cut through Soviet formations again and again, turning columns into smoking wrecks. The situation grew so desperate that Soviet command was forced to evacuate its headquarters to Voronezh, fleeing the storm of tanks and bombers that now tore eastward. Case Blue had begun with fire and fury, and beneath that fury, destiny was quietly taking shape on the long road to Stalingrad on June 30th, as reports poured in of German tanks slicing through Soviet defenses. Joseph Stalin realized the gravity of the situation. He ordered General Yakov Fedorenko, head of the Red Army's armored forces, to assume direct command over more than 1,000 tanks massed in the region, from the nimble T-60s to the hulking KV series heavy armor. On paper, this was an intimidating force. In reality, it was chaos disguised as strength. Despite their numerical advantage, the Soviet armored divisions struggled to coordinate. Their tanks appeared sporadically on the battlefield, unorganized, unsupported, and ultimately ineffective against the precise, synchronized advance of Hoth's panzer divisions. By July 7th, German troops had seized vast swaths of Voronezh, including its critical bridge network over the Don River. Soviet attempts to reclaim the crossings ended in catastrophe, poorly planned, hastily executed, and smashed apart by relentless German artillery and air power. Another attempted offensive, launched between Voronezh and Kursk, met the same fate. A storm of German fire that silenced the Soviet advance before it truly began. But the Red Army's resilience was fierce, if not always strategic. Reinforcements poured into the city, wave after wave of exhausted men ordered forward with little coordination. What followed was a brutal street-by-street struggle, a grinding urban inferno. Buildings collapsed under artillery fire. Every shattered wall became a fortress for snipers and machine gunners, forcing German troops to clear entire blocks with flamethrowers and high explosive shells. By the time the infantry reinforcements arrived to relieve the tank crews, Hoth's armored units had been reassigned. Their next target lay to the southeast, Stalingrad. They were to link up with Paulus's Sixth Army, converging for what was expected to be the decisive assault on the Volga. But just as German morale soared, the momentum began to crumble. Two fatal flaws long foreseen by their own strategists began to surface. First came the logistical nightmare. The deeper the Wehrmacht pushed into Soviet territory, the more their supply lines stretched and strained. Entire divisions found themselves 10 days ahead of schedule, far beyond the reach of consistent resupply. Fuel shortages became the great silent enemy. Tanks that had thundered across the steppe now sat idle, their engines cold, their crews waiting helplessly for deliveries that never came. The Luftwaffe attempted to fill the gap. Transport planes, the dependable Junkers Ju-52s, made desperate supply runs. But their capacity was limited, and they required makeshift airstrips that had to be captured or built from scratch. Every flight carried risk. Every delay cost the front momentum. Then came the second fracture, a growing rift between Field Marshal Fedor von Bock and Hitler's high command. The Führer's obsession with micromanagement was strangling the very military genius that had built Germany's early successes. In the proud Prussian tradition, commanders had once been trusted with freedom of action, given an objective, resources, and the autonomy to achieve victory their own way. It was this doctrine that had birthed men like Rommel, leaders who thrived in chaos and turned flexibility into conquest. Now, that freedom was gone. Orders from Berlin dictated every maneuver, every deployment, every pause. Von Bock and his generals felt the chains tighten. The front was moving faster than Berlin could think, and yet they were forbidden to act without permission. In that suffocating system, the seeds of disaster were quietly taking root, even as the Wehrmacht continued to march toward Stalingrad. Confident that victory was within reach by midsummer, Hitler himself had taken direct control of operations, a dangerous shift for the German army. The Führer might have been a master of rhetoric, but he was no field general, and his obsession with command details soon began to suffocate his own officers. Field Marshal von Bock, a seasoned strategist with a lifetime of military discipline, suddenly found himself arguing with a man who had once been nothing more than a corporal. The dispute centered on the next stage of Case Blue, and it would mark a decisive fracture between logic and ego. Hitler demanded an immediate southern thrust. The 1st Panzer Army was to advance from the south, link up with Hoth's armored divisions, and complete a grand encirclement. He envisioned another sweeping victory, another pocket filled with hundreds of thousands of dead or captured Soviets. But von Bock knew better. The Red Army had already withdrawn from much of the area. The battlefield Hitler imagined existed only in his mind. The Soviets were reorganizing along new defensive positions near the Voronezh front, and von Bock wanted to crush these fresh Soviet lines before pushing toward Stalingrad to Hitler. This was hesitation weakness. To von Bock, it was military sanity. The two visions collided. Hitler fumed in his headquarters, complaining that von Bock was wasting time in Voronezh. Distracted by a secondary objective, he believed the field marshal was being too cautious, failing to seize fleeting opportunities for glory. His patience snapped. In July 1942, Hitler's confidence in von Bock collapsed. What followed was one of the most disastrous command reshuffles of the entire Eastern Front. He decided to split Army Group South in two. Army Group A, under Field Marshal Wilhelm List, was assigned to push into the Caucasus, tasked with capturing the vital oil fields at Maikop, Grozny, and Baku. It included the 1st Panzer Army, the 11th and 17th Armies, and the Romanian 3rd Army Group B, still under von Bock, would secure the northern flank and push towards Stalingrad, spearheaded by Paulus's 6th Army, supported by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian divisions. Hitler believed the Soviets had regrouped near the Lower Don River and ordered Hoth's 4th Panzer Army to move south behind Paulus's forces to help encircle the enemy and assist von Kleist's drive into the Caucasus. But there was a problem. There was no enemy to encircle. The Soviets had vanished into the steppe, retreating far beyond the reach of the German trap. Instead of triumph, the redeployment became a logistical nightmare. Entire columns of tanks, artillery, and trucks clogged the same narrow supply routes, turning once fluid movement into chaos. The very speed that had defined Germany's blitzkrieg now worked against them. Convoys jammed for miles. Fuel convoys delayed other divisions, and supply trains were forced to idle for hours on railways overflowing with equipment bound in conflicting directions. Traffic jams, not enemy fire, became one of the German army's greatest obstacles. And so, as Hitler's grand vision fractured into confusion and delay, the Wehrmacht's momentum began to stall. Every wasted hour on those jammed Russian roads brought Stalingrad one step closer to becoming the grave of Hitler's ambition. By midsummer, Hitler's fixation on Stalingrad had transformed from a tactical goal into a personal obsession. The city was no longer just a point on a map. It was a symbol. To take Stalin's city would be to humiliate the Soviet leader himself, to brand the Nazi swastika into the heart of the Soviet soul. As preparations for the offensive took shape, Paulus and his 6th Army were confident. The open countryside between them and the city concealed their movements, and with Luftwaffe fighters dominating the skies, they believed they could strike swiftly and silently. The date was set, July 17, 1942. But fate once again had other plans. Just 48 hours before the attack, the first clash erupted unexpectedly near the Morozovsk railway station. A small detachment of the Soviet 147th Rifle Division, supported by a company of T-34 tanks, appeared suddenly on the horizon. German infantry scrambled into nearby farmhouses, hastily turning them into makeshift strongholds, while tanks and vehicles were still being unloaded from trains. Then, at 1740 hours on July 16th, the silence shattered. From the Morozov farm, 3 T-34s and 2 T-60 rolled forward, scouting for German positions. The Germans opened fire immediately, but their shells bounced harmlessly off the thick sloped armor of the Soviet tanks. Within minutes, several German guns were destroyed and their infantry, scattered. One T-34 suffered a mechanical breakdown, but the Soviets withdrew intact. Believing they had faced only a minor reconnaissance unit, the Germans launched a small pursuit force of 4 tanks and several anti-tank crews. What they encountered instead stopped them cold. 2 full Soviet tank companies lying in wait. The engagement turned into a chaotic, close-range firefight of steel and smoke. The Germans fought bravely, knocking out 1 T-34 and damaging 2 others, but the Soviets held the ground. 2 German tanks were destroyed, a third was captured after being disabled, and several anti-tank positions were obliterated. And so, even before the official assault began, the Battle of Stalingrad had already drawn first blood. At dawn on July 17, 1942, General Friedrich Paulus finally gave the order. The push for Stalingrad begins, reinforced by the 24th Panzer Division and several fresh units. The mighty 6th Army surged forward. Nearly 400,000 men, infantry, armor, and artillery moved eastward, unaware that they were marching not toward glory, but toward one of the bloodiest and most tragic battles in human history. Despite their overwhelming strength, Paulus's 6th Army was not immune to the same silent enemy haunting the entire Eastern Front. Supply shortages, fuel, ammunition, and provisions began to lag far behind the front line, slowing the advance toward Stalingrad to a grinding crawl. Even Paulus's fellow commanders, men like General von Weichs, wondered aloud why Hoth's panzer divisions, already crossing paths with Paulus's army, were not ordered to push directly into Stalingrad alongside him. But such questions were dangerous, for Hitler's word was law, and his growing obsession with micromanagement left no room for dissent. That same day, Hitler's fury flared once more. Convinced that Fedor von Bock had failed him, the Führer dismissed him from command of Army Group B, replacing him with Maximilian von Weichs. The once respected general was exiled into quiet retirement, never again trusted with senior command. Meanwhile, on the Soviet side, reality was dawning. Stalingrad was now a declared German target. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko, recognizing the magnitude of what was coming, issued Directive Number 23. Hold the Stalingrad front at all costs. But the cost would be staggering. Unable to contain the German advance, Timoshenko soon faced Stalin's wrath. On July 21st, he was dismissed and replaced by Lieutenant General Vasily Gordov, who inherited a collapsing front on the battlefield. Paulus's 6th Army now clashed violently with the Soviet 62nd Army, hammering its right flank with relentless precision. Victory seemed within reach until the Soviets counterattacked with ferocious resolve. Without sufficient air cover, Soviet tanks became easy prey for the Luftwaffe, bombed mercilessly as they tried to swing around Paulus's left rear. Yet, despite catastrophic losses, they kept coming wave after wave, steel against steel, driven not by orders alone, but by sheer tenacity and desperation. It was here, amid the thunder of artillery and the scream of dive bombers, that the battle for Stalingrad truly began to take shape, a test of endurance, will, and madness that neither side could yet comprehend. By July 29th, the tides of war began to shift once more. The Red Army, relentless and newly galvanized, struck hard, threatening to encircle Paulus's Sixth Army in a deadly pincer movement. For the first time in a campaign, the German advance stalled. The hunters had become the hunted. Trapped between converging Soviet forces, Paulus found his men fighting for survival rather than conquest. For days, brutal and chaotic combat raged across the steppe, artillery thundering, tanks burning, cities reduced to smoke and rubble. Inch by inch, the Sixth Army clawed its way forward again, bloodied but unbroken, until they once more pushed toward their destiny, the city on the Volga, Stalingrad. By late August, the Germans stood on the city's outskirts. From the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin could now see it clearly, the Germans' true aim and the threat to the city that bore his name. What he saw infuriated him. His armies had yielded vast territories: Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, the Donbass, all lost with little visible resistance. To Stalin, this meant only one thing: cowardice. On July 28, 1942, he unleashed his wrath in the form of a single historic decree, Order Number 227. It began as both a condemnation and a call to arms. The people of our country, though they love the Red Army, are losing faith in it. They curse it for retreating, for abandoning them to the German oppressors. Some fools say we can retreat endlessly, that we have enough land, enough people, enough grain. These are lies. Every step back weakens our motherland and strengthens our enemy. Therefore, the time for retreat is over, not one step back. Those words, cold and absolute, echoed across the entire Soviet Union. Not one step back became more than a slogan. It became a death sentence for any soldier who hesitated, any officer who wavered. Behind every frontline unit stood NKVD barrier troops, armed not to fight the Germans, but to shoot retreat to Soviets. With this single order, Stalin transformed desperation into defiance. The Red Army would no longer retreat, no longer yield another inch of sacred soil. Stalingrad would become their fortress and their grave. Thus, with Order Number 227, the stage was set for the most ferocious confrontation in modern history, the ultimate collision of two ruthless ideologies: Hitler's National Socialism versus Stalin's communism. The world would soon learn the price of those words whispered through the ranks of 1,000,000 men, not one step back. To ensure absolute obedience, Stalin's brutal decree came with an equally brutal mechanism of enforcement. Behind every line of advancing Soviet soldiers stood machine gun teams chosen from the most reliable troops. Their orders were clear: if anyone turned back, shoot them. It didn't matter whether the attack was hopeless or the enemy's position impregnable. Retreat equaled death either by German bullets or Soviet ones. And Stalin's ruthlessness didn't stop with his army. Civilians, too, were trapped inside Stalingrad. Instead of evacuation, they were conscripted into survival-digging trenches, building barricades, hauling supplies to the front, and even manufacturing weapons as bombs fell around them. Men, women, and children all became part of the war machine, not by choice, but by decree. Stalin believed that keeping civilians inside the city would give his soldiers something more tangible to fight for their families, their people, their pride. In his cold logic, the presence of innocence would turn fear into fury. And in a way, it worked. Amid the chaos, there burned a raw, desperate courage among the Soviet ranks. Yet trust between soldiers and their commanders was fragile at best. Paranoia, Stalin's favorite weapon, poisoned every level of command. Officers feared their own men, and men feared their officers. Every order carried the shadow of suspicion. Stalin never forgot what happened in the First World War when the old Imperial Russian army turned against the Tsar, a revolution he himself had helped ignite. He lived in terror that history might repeat itself, that his own soldiers might rise against him. So he ruled through fear, binding his army together with the knowledge that betrayal meant death. But despite the fear, despite the mistrust, something deeper took hold in Stalingrad. The soldiers knew what awaited them if they failed. They had seen it in the towns. The Germans had already captured mass executions, rape, the slaughter of children and the elderly. That knowledge, the unthinkable cruelty of the invader, hardened their resolve into steel. It was no longer just about communism or orders or Stalin. It was about vengeance, survival, and the sacred duty to protect what little remained of home. And so, in the hell that was Stalingrad, the Soviet spirit ignited. Not because of ideology, but because there was simply no other choice. Like the Germans, the Soviets were constantly haunted by one enemy that couldn't be shot or bombed: supply shortages. The endless stretch of the Eastern Front devoured everything: bullets, fuel, food, and time. And while Stalin's relocation of arms factories deep into the East had saved them from German bombers, it also meant weapons took far longer to reach the front. The British and Americans did what they could: convoys of ships braving the freezing Arctic seas to deliver tanks, trucks, and guns. But after the disaster of convoy PQ-17, those missions were halted. The Soviets would have to wait for winter, when darkness might once again cloak the convoys from German eyes. So by August 1942, Stalingrad's defenders were fighting with whatever they could find: old rifles, mismatched ammunition, captured weapons, anything that could kill a man. Whole battalions carried only one type of gun if they were lucky. Riflemen could strike from afar but were helpless in close combat. Soldiers with submachine guns dominated tight alleyways but couldn't touch an enemy across the street. And for many, there weren't enough guns to go around. It became a nightmare of brutal efficiency. One soldier armed, another unarmed, but carrying spare rounds, waiting for his comrade to fall so he could pick up the weapon and keep fighting. By August 23rd, there was no more time to prepare. Paulus's 6th Army, now joined by Hoth's 4th Panzer Army attacking from the south, was closing in on the city. The Soviets stood ready behind rubble and trenches, but the first strike didn't come from the tanks. It came from above. The Luftwaffe had been the hammer of every German advance, a storm of steel and fire that broke the enemy before the panzers even arrived. And now, under a new commander, it was ready to unleash hell on Stalingrad. General Wolfram von Richthofen, cousin of the legendary Red Baron, had taken over air command, a fierce, brilliant tactician and a perfectionist who demanded results. His men respected him. His fellow generals, especially Hoth, often despised him. He was bold, arrogant, and obsessed with domination from the skies. Richthofen had perfected close air support in Spain and Poland, turning it into a deadly art form. By the time Germany invaded France, now at Stalingrad, he planned to put on his masterpiece, a bombing campaign unlike anything the world had seen. Wave after wave of German bombers roared over the Volga, dropping tons of high explosives and incendiary bombs designed not just to destroy, but to burn the city alive. Wooden homes, oil tanks, and factories ignited instantly, merging into an unstoppable inferno. For those trapped below, soldiers, families, children, there was no escape. Flames sucked the oxygen from bunkers and basements, suffocating hundreds at once. The sky turned black with smoke. The river glowed red with fire. When the bombardment ended, tens of thousands lay dead, and Stalingrad was no longer a city, it was a furnace. But through the smoke and ash, something stirred. The Soviets were still alive, and the real battle for Stalingrad was only beginning. As the thunder of Richthofen's bombers roared above, Paulus's spearhead began its ruthless push into Stalingrad. On the right flank thundered the 14th Panzer Corps, and on the left, the 51st Corps, both driving forward like twin blades aimed at the heart of the city. The Soviets fought ferociously. Every building, every trench, every shattered street corner became a fortress. But still, the Germans smashed through the first lines, cutting deep into the city's northern sector and finally reaching the banks of the Volga. It was a tactical triumph, a momentary sense of victory, but it vanished as fast as it came. Within hours, Soviet reinforcements flooded the gap, with the 62nd, 64th, and 1st Guards armies closing in from all directions. The German vanguard suddenly found itself trapped, surrounded on all sides, isolated from Paulus's main force. Paulus knew that if he didn't act fast, an entire spearhead of his army would be annihilated. He immediately ordered a relief operation, but Stalin's men, forbidden by Order 227 to take a single step backward, resisted with a ferocity that shocked even the battle-hardened Germans. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe turned the city into hell itself. Bombers swept over Stalingrad day and night, tearing at its skeleton, crushing Soviet defenses and trying to keep the Red Army away from the encircled German units. But even the air power of the Reich couldn't speed up the rescue. The relief effort dragged on for days. The Luftwaffe resorted to desperate air supply drops, parachuting crates of ammunition and rations into the inferno below. On August 25th, in a show of arrogance and morbid pride, General von Richthofen himself joined one of the bombing raids. From the cockpit of his personal plane, he looked down on the burning ruins of Stalingrad with what he later described as a magnificent spectacle. To him, it was another Warsaw, a masterpiece of destruction. To the world, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Paulus, unwilling to lose his men, sent in the 48th Panzer Corps on a daring rescue thrust. Their tanks crawled into the city's smoking maze, where every alley was an ambush, every basement a sniper's nest. Soviet infantry, hidden in rubble and shadows, struck from all sides. The Germans managed to reach their trapped comrades and deliver supplies, but they couldn't hold the line. Without infantry cover, the panzers were forced to retreat before they, too, were surrounded further south. Hoth's 4th Panzer Army launched its own attack, driving northward toward the Volga. But here, too, the Soviets held their ground with grim determination. The German advance stalled, and Hoth had to pull back and regroup. Yet, ironically, Soviet confidence became their weakness. Believing the southern flank was safe, they shifted troops north to reinforce the fight against Paulus. And that's when Hoth struck again. This time, his tanks smashed through Soviet resistance, crumbled under the renewed German assault. And soon the Red Army was forced back into the smoking ruins of Stalingrad itself. After a week of savage combat and relentless bombing, Paulus finally succeeded in linking up with his encircled units. The relief was short-lived, however. What the Germans didn't yet realize was that this was merely a prelude, the first grim rehearsal for the nightmare of encirclement that would later doom the entire Sixth Army. As the Germans tightened their grip on the city, they seized several vital airfields, including the major base at Potomac, on September 3rd, just 15 kilometers west of the city center. It was a critical victory. With its long concrete runway and facilities for large transport aircraft like the Focke-Wulf FW-200, Potomac became the lifeline for German resupply. And later, their only escape route, Stalin, desperate to reinforce the defense, ordered waves of soldiers ferried across the Volga on barges. But the river itself had become a killing field. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, strafing and bombing the Soviet boats as they crossed. The water turned crimson with blood and fuel. Those who survived the crossing were thrown straight into the fight. No time to rest, no chance to breathe. Many were handed a rifle and a handful of bullets. Others, nothing at all. They charged into the inferno, knowing full well they wouldn't live to see another sunrise. At this stage of the battle, the average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier entering Stalingrad was less than 24 hours. And yet, they came again and again into the flames. The Battle of Stalingrad had truly begun, and neither side was ready for what came next. When the Soviet soldiers survived their first fiery baptism, they began to see the destruction around them not as a curse, but as a weapon. The German bombings that had shattered Stalingrad into rubble had also created a fortress, a labyrinth of broken concrete, twisted steel, and fire-scorched ruins that turned every block into a trap. Within this chaos, Soviet troops melted into the ruins' ghosts in the smoke, waiting for the right moment to strike. Snipers haunted the upper floors of crumbling buildings, hunting German officers with cold precision. Small squads emerged from hidden basements or collapsed stairwells to ambush patrols at point-blank range. The city had swallowed the invader whole. German tanks, once symbols of unstoppable power, were now almost useless. Streets were choked with debris, barricades, and wreckage. The panzers could barely move. Their engines screamed against the rubble, while Soviet grenades rained from every window. Stalingrad had become an infantryman's war, a place where a single ruined room could be worth a dozen lives. Still, the Germans pushed forward. On September 14th, the final drive toward the Volga began a brutal, grinding assault through the very heart of a burning city. The next day, German troops reached the looming grain elevator, a colossal concrete structure rising 35 meters high and stretching nearly 100 long, one of Stalingrad's industrial giants. Its staff had long since joined the fight, and among them, Lieutenant Polyakov saw the elevator for what it truly was, a fortress. He gathered just 27 men, armed with a few rifles, machine guns and mortars, and fortified the structure. That afternoon, German infantry supported by panzers attacked. But to their disbelief, the tiny Soviet garrison held. For 2 more days, the elevator defied everything thrown at it: machine gun fire, grenades, even Stuka dive bombers screaming down from the clouds. Still, it stood. German soldier Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote bitterly in his journal, "The elevator is not held by men, but by devils that no flames or bullets can destroy." Frustration turned to fury. The Germans encircled the elevator and poured artillery fire into its sides day and night. The structure shook, cracked, and burned, but the defenders did not break. On September 21st, as ammunition ran low, the Germans tried psychological warfare, sending Soviet collaborators to beg the defenders to surrender. Polyakov's reply was silence. Then gunfire. That day, his men killed 30 Germans and wounded 72 before darkness fell. But Polyakov knew it was over. The night of September 23rd, he led a desperate breakout. Only 15 men made it back to Soviet lines. The shattered elevator became a legend. Its image spread across the Soviet Union, a towering symbol of unbreakable defiance. In Berlin, the mood was very different. Reports from the front horrified German commanders. The enemy wasn't breaking. They were digging in deeper, fighting harder. The elite Wehrmacht, trained in swift and surgical blitzkrieg warfare, found itself dragged backward in time to a primitive battle of attrition, fought room by room, street by street, with knives, bayonets, and bare hands. Casualties soared on both sides, but the Germans could least afford the loss. Their divisions were shrinking, bleeding out in a city that refused to die. From his headquarters, General Franz Halder, the German chief of staff, warned Hitler this battle was draining the army, and if it continued, it would consume them all. But Hitler refused to listen. To him, Stalingrad was no longer a city, it was a symbol, a test of will between two tyrants. Stalin's name was on it, and Hitler was obsessed with erasing it. This was no longer strategy. It was ego, pride, and madness, and it would drag the Sixth Army to its grave. Casualties in Paulus's and Hoth's formations were staggering, losses so severe that replacements became a daily prayer. Tanks, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, were wearing out. Engines and armor punished by constant use, barrels of field guns scorched thin from endless firing, the Luftwaffe, exhausted by continuous sorties, supporting both the drive to the Caucasus and the assault on Stalingrad, showed signs of fatigue in both men and machines. Supply lines, already fragile, now frayed under the strain. Food and fuel lagged, ammunition ran low. Desperation seeped into the ranks, soldiers stealing rations from ruined stores, shooting their pack horses for meat. When there was nothing left, Hitler would not hear caution. He dismissed General Franz Halder, his chief of staff, on September 24th, branding his warnings as defeatist. The only immediate remedy seemed to be shifting units from quiet sectors on the flanks places held by Romanian and Italian formations into the teeth of Stalingrad slaughter. The decision was logical on paper, but terrifying in practice. Those Allied divisions were often ill-equipped and poorly led compared to German standards. Still, there was no other choice. On September 30th, blinded by hubris, Hitler proclaimed Stalingrad nearly fallen a public boast, far from the bitter reality Paulus and Hoth remained locked in a grinding stalemate. The Soviets still clung to a stubborn 9-mile strip along the river's edge. In some places, the front ran so close to the Volga that German and Soviet guns exchanged fire across the water itself. Yet the defenders would not yield. Order number 227 had sealed their fate. No retreat, no mercy. Far to the south, the great prize, the Caucasus oil fields, also slipped from German grasp. The attempts to seize the wells and pipelines had not solved the Reich's hunger for fuel. Instead, columns stalled, tanks ran dry, and sabotage bought the Soviets precious hours to destroy what they could before losing it. The more Germany reached, the more it bled. Ironically, the fuel that Germany hoped to capture only hastened the exhaustion of its forces. Worried and impatient, Hitler sent Alfred Jodl to inspect Army Group A. Field Marshal Wilhelm List laid out a litany of problems: overstretched lines, worn equipment, devastated roads, and Jodl returned to Berlin with the grim report Hitler's answer was to relieve List and assume personal control of the Caucasus Drive. As October's chill began to bite, reality forced a bitter admission. The oil would not be taken before winter. In anger and spite, Hitler ordered von Richthofen to begin bombing the remaining Soviet-held fields on October 8th. If he could not possess the oil, then no one would. It was a spiteful gesture and a small consolation for a leader who believed the city was nearly his. He did not yet understand how the coming cold and the patient plans of his enemy would undo him. Behind the Soviet lines, strategy had been quietly forming. Marshal Zhukov watched the German redeployments with a cold, calculating eye. He observed how German strength was being drawn inward toward the city, while the flanks thinned and the Axis allies held vast stretches with little resistance. Zhukov realized the moment had arrived. Rather than hurling more men into ruined streets, the Red Army would attempt a vast encirclement strike through the weak northern and southern wings, cut the Germans off, and turn the hunter into the trapped. History, that summer of iron and smoke, was moving toward its most terrible pivot. Zhukov named his grand counterstroke Operation Uranus. after the ancient god of the heavens and forefather of Mars, the god of war. The symbolism was deliberate. This blow would be vast, cosmic, and all-encompassing. Nearly 1 million Soviet troops, thousands of tanks, and a reborn Red Air Force were gathered in secret, poised to strike. Concealing an operation of that magnitude from German eyes was a miracle of deception and logistics. Delays were constant. Trains had to be rerouted, fuel hidden, and ammunition dispersed. But by the cold morning of November 19th, 1942, everything was ready. At 7:20 a.m. Moscow time, the silence north of Stalingrad shattered. The Romanian Third Army, thinly stretched, poorly armed, guarding the German flank, was suddenly engulfed in an avalanche of Soviet fire. Artillery and Katyusha rockets roared for 80 straight minutes, tearing trenches apart and pulverizing bunkers. When the thunder finally faded, the survivors looked up to see the silhouettes of more than 200 T-34 tanks grinding forward through the smoke. To their credit, the Romanians fought bravely, even repelling the first Soviet wave. But the defense was doomed. They lacked anti-tank weapons, their lines fractured, and soon the front dissolved into chaos. Retreat turned to rout. The next morning, the full picture emerged. Far to the south, another storm of rockets, more than 1,000 Katyushas, opened the second front of Zhukov's trap, smashing through the Romanian Fourth Army Soviet infantry, and armor surged in behind the fire, sweeping westward before pivoting north in a massive pincer movement that encircled Stalingrad itself. By November 23rd, just 4 days after the first barrage, the jaws closed at the small town of Kalash-on-Don. The Soviet blitzkrieg had succeeded. The encirclement was complete. Trapped within the tightening ring were the entire German Sixth Army and elements of the Fourth Panzer Army, nearly 265,000 men, including General Paulus himself. For the Germans, it was a map-maker's nightmare come alive. On paper, they were surrounded. In reality, Paulus still believed he could break out, rejoin the main Wehrmacht forces to the west, and escape before the Soviets solidified their positions. But Hitler forbade it. To retreat, he declared, was unthinkable. The German soldier stands fast, he thundered, or dies where he stands. And so Paulus and his men remained, trapped in what history would call the Stalingrad pocket, and what the soldiers themselves grimly named the cauldron. From that moment, their survival depended entirely on the sky. With every land route severed, the burden of keeping 250,000 men alive fell on the exhausted Luftwaffe. Calculations were desperate. At least 500 tons of food, ammunition, and fuel would need to be flown, and every single day Paulus requested 750 tons to sustain even minimal operations. A handful of captured airfields, most notably Potomac, still lay within German lines. But winter was closing in, and the task ahead was immense, a race between starvation and salvation, fought under a frozen enemy sky. The backbone of the Luftwaffe's desperate resupply mission was the Junkers Ju-52, a rugged, slow, but dependable workhorse that had already earned a reputation for reliability. It would now face its ultimate test, flying in and out of the frozen inferno of Stalingrad under conditions no aircraft was ever built to endure. But the math was brutal. Even under perfect circumstances, considering the Ju-52's limited cargo capacity, flight times, and the near-constant need for repairs after punishing sorties, Luftwaffe analysts calculated they'd need at least 10,500 aircraft to sustain the 6th Army with the bare minimum of supplies required. Only 4,845 had ever been built. Faced with this impossible arithmetic, Hermann Goering, head of the Luftwaffe, had no choice but to pull bombers from the front line's aircraft originally meant to strike Soviet positions or protect advancing troops. These bombers were ill-suited for the task. They could not carry heavy loads or large equipment, and using them meant sacrificing Germany's offensive capability and vital close air support elsewhere. Still, Goering, desperate to maintain Hitler's confidence, promised the impossible. He assured the Führer that his Luftwaffe would keep Paulus's men alive, citing earlier small-scale airlifts as proof. What he didn't admit was that none of those missions had been remotely comparable to the scale of Stalingrad. And to make matters worse, a critical miscalculation by one of his staff officers, Hans Jeschonek, had dramatically overestimated the cargo each plane could carry. By the time this error was discovered, the airlift was already underway, and both Goering and Hitler chose to ignore it. Pride demanded they proceed, even as reality screamed otherwise. There was yet another fatal flaw. The Luftwaffe no longer ruled the skies. For months, they had enjoyed air superiority. But now, the Red Air Force was returning in overwhelming numbers. German fighter aces could still down 5 Soviet planes in a single encounter, but when 20 or 30 attacked at once, individual skill could no longer shift the balance. Nevertheless, the German pilots fought on with staggering courage. They flew until their engines froze and their bodies gave out, landing only to refuel, reload, and take off again. Among them was Kurt Ebner, a fighter ace whose younger brother was trapped inside Stalingrad with the infantry. Ebner downed 30 Soviet aircraft during the battle, driven by the desperate hope of keeping his brother alive. His efforts were in vain. His brother would never walk out of the ruined city. As the airlift continued, it became clear the numbers simply didn't add up on average. Barely 200 tons of supplies reached the 6th Army each day. less than half of what was needed just to survive. Goering poured in more aircraft, even bombers, some of which tried to parachute supplies blindly into the chaos below, but the devastation made it nearly impossible to tell friend from foe. Many drops fell straight into Soviet hands. Then, on December 7, 1942, came the Luftwaffe's best day at so-called peak performance. That day, it delivered 363 tons of supplies. It was the highest number ever achieved. 2 days later, on December 9th, the Red Air Force launched a devastating counterattack, striking the main German air base at Tatsinskaya, from which most of the Stalingrad supplies were flown. In a single raid, they destroyed 4 transport planes, 75 tons of fuel, and 6,000 rounds of ammunition, all destined for Paulus's trapped soldiers. Inside Hitler's command circle, no one could deny the truth anymore. The Luftwaffe could not save the Sixth Army. Air superiority was gone. Winter had frozen the Volga solid, allowing the Soviets to truck supplies across its icy surface, and starvation was tightening its grip inside the pocket. The question was no longer, can we save them? But rather, will Hitler allow Paulus to escape? The answer came on December 18th. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group Don, dispatched an officer to Stalingrad with plans for a daring rescue. The operation was codenamed Winter Storm. The strategy was simple and desperate. Manstein's external forces would break through from the southwest, while Paulus's Sixth Army would simultaneously fight outward from inside the pocket in a coordinated assault known as Thunderclap. If successful, the two forces would link up, stabilize a new defensive line outside the city, and hold off Soviet counterattacks through the winter. By the time the messenger reached Paulus, Winter Storm had already begun. On December 12th, German artillery thundered across the frozen steppe, marking the start of the last great attempt to save the Sixth Army and perhaps Hitler's war itself. The German counteroffensive initially struck like a lightning bolt. Manstein's forces smashed through the Soviet front lines, driving toward the Stalingrad cauldron where Paulus and his men were trapped. For a fleeting moment, it seemed salvation might be possible. But the Red Army refused to yield. Within 24 hours, the Soviet defense stiffened, grinding the German advance to a slow, bloody crawl. Manstein's carefully crafted plan had depended on overwhelming force, more troops, more tanks, more supplies, but he had been denied the reinforcements he needed. The extra panzer divisions that might have tipped the balance had been tied down elsewhere, guarding fragile sectors that could not be left undefended. Without them, his spearhead lacked the strength to deliver a decisive blow. Meanwhile, inside Stalingrad, Paulus prepared for his part in the operation, the Breakout, codenamed Thunderclap. he gathered what little ammunition and fuel remained, ready to fight westward and meet Manstein's relief force halfway. But the entire plan rested on a fatal misunderstanding. Hitler knew nothing about it. When news of Thunderclap reached the Führer, his reaction was explosive. Outraged that any retreat had even been considered, he vetoed the plan outright. No German soldier, he declared, would abandon the ground he had taken. Instead, Paulus was to hold his position inside the Stalingrad pocket at all costs, while Manstein's army was expected to fight its way in from outside, an impossible demand. As if to mock this madness, the Soviets launched yet another offensive. On the very same day Operation Winter Storm began. This new assault, Operation Little Saturn, tore into the Italian and Hungarian divisions protecting the German flanks. In the Caucasus, entire armies disintegrated, their lines collapsing under the Soviet tide. The attack not only threatened Manstein's rear, but also strangled his supply routes and consumed reinforcements that might have turned the tide at Stalingrad. Inside the pocket, Paulus received word of Thunderclap's cancellation. His heart sank. A few days later, fresh Soviet attacks hammered his exhausted men, who were now running dangerously low on food, fuel, and hope. Outside the city, Manstein's army fought desperately on, clawing forward kilometer by kilometer through ice and blood. But without Paulus advancing toward him, the distance was too great. Manstein pleaded with Hitler again. Let the Sixth Army break out. Let them fight to us. Hitler's answer was cold and final: no retreat. With the Führer's mind made up, Manstein turned to Paulus directly, urging him to disobey orders and save his army. But Paulus, the model of German discipline, refused to betray his oath. He would not move without the Führer's command. By December 23rd, Manstein could no longer risk his relief force. The Red Army was closing in, and his spearhead itself was in danger of being encircled. Reluctantly, he ordered a withdrawal. The lifeline to Stalingrad was severed forever. That night, as snow and smoke choked the frozen city, a haunting sound echoed through the ruins, German soldiers singing Christmas carols among the thundered artillery. It was December 24th, 1942. For one night, the horrors paused not in reality, but in the hearts of men desperate for a moment of peace. Yet even Christmas brought no mercy. The next morning, the Soviets struck the Tatsinskaya airfield, the last major hub for Luftwaffe supply flights. The attack destroyed aircraft, fuel, and ammunition, crippling the airlift and forcing surviving planes to fly longer routes through dangerous skies. Amid the cold and chaos, Dr. Kurt Ruber, a German physician trapped in the Stalingrad pocket, described that night in his diary. I spent Christmas evening with the other doctors and the sick. We raised our mugs and drank to those we loved. But before we could taste the wine, bombs fell outside. My shelter, decorated for Christmas, became a dressing station. One of the dying men had been singing a carol moments earlier. He said, "I'll finish the song first." Then he was gone. Ruber, who had once been a pastor, tended not only to shattered bodies, but to shattered souls, whispering prayers amid the thunder of distant artillery as the snow outside turned red with blood. In the dim, freezing light of those final December nights, Dr. Kurt Ruber, the same man who prayed over the die on Christmas Eve, found a fragile way to bring hope to the hopeless. On the back of a captured Soviet map, he sketched the image of a Madonna cradling a child, the face serene, the lines trembling but filled with grace. He hung it on the wall of his bunker. Within days, soldiers began to visit wounded men, starving men, men who had long stopped believing in miracles. They called it the Madonna of Stalingrad. For a few minutes, standing before that simple drawing, they remembered the world beyond fire and snow, a world where warmth, love, and home still existed. But comfort was a foreign word in the Stalingrad pocket. By the end of December, the men of the Sixth Army had grown so accustomed to starvation that hunger no longer felt like pain, only a dull emptiness overshadowed by the killing cold. They huddled together in shallow dugouts, sharing scraps of body heat, their breath freezing in the air. Food was all but gone. 200 grams of bread a day, that was the official ration, when it existed at all. The desperate turned cruel. Civilians found with even a crust of bread risked execution. Corpses, friend or foe, was stripped for crumbs, for frozen tins, for anything that could be chewed. Water came only from melting snow or the icy waters of the Volga, but crossing the open banks meant death. Soviet snipers lay in wait, watching for movement. Then came one of the darkest moments of all. In their desperation, German soldiers began sending Soviet orphans, some no older than 5 or 6, to fetch water for them from the river. They promised chocolate or food promises that meant nothing. The children, clinging to that hope, obeyed. When Soviet commanders realized what was happening, they issued a pitiless order. Shoot them, they are serving the enemy. And so the snow turned red, not just with the blood of soldiers, but of children caught between monsters. By the first days of January 1943, the German airlift, that fragile lifeline of hope, was collapsing. The Luftwaffe's transports had been flying day and night, in storms, through Soviet flak and fighter fire. Their pilots were exhausted, their planes battered to breaking. Each mission was a gamble. To land on shattered airstrips under artillery fire, unload supplies in minutes, and take off again into fog and chaos. One German gunner After running out of ammunition while fighting off Soviet fighters, threw whatever he could find out of the aircraft hatch tools, helmets, even a roll of toilet paper, anything to fight back. But the greatest enemy of the airlift was not Soviet fire. It was the Russian winter itself. Snow and fog closed the makeshift airfields for days. Craters from constant shelling hid beneath the drifts, swallowing landing gear and wrecking planes as they touched down. Every crash meant another crew trapped inside the pocket, more mouths to feed, fewer aircraft left to fly out. Those who could leave did so only if they were gravely wounded. Soldiers begged to be marked as injured, hoping to escape the white tomb Stalingrad had become. But space was scarce. Most knew they would never leave. At last, even Hitler conceded a sliver of mercy. He allowed the evacuation of 7,000 German women nurses, clerks, and medics who had served alongside the army. He knew too well what awaited them if captured by the Red Army. The Luftwaffe carried them out under heavy fire, the last to leave before the skies above Stalingrad turned fully hostile. Behind them, hundreds of thousands of men remained starving, frostbitten, surrounded, their world shrinking to a few burning streets by the Volga. And above the wreckage, somewhere deep beneath the ice and smoke, Ruber's Madonna still looked down, a faint echo of peace amid the end of all things. By January 1943, Stalingrad had ceased to be a battlefield. It had become a tomb. The once proud 6th Army, which had marched east 265,000 strong, now clung to life in a pocket of frozen rubble scarcely a few kilometers across. Outside the ring, German forces were reeling under the Soviet advance. Inside, starvation, disease, and despair had hollowed out what remained of Paulus's men. Only Hitler still believed they could somehow hold on. Then, on January 9th, the Soviets changed tactics. Instead of more shells, they sent down paper, tens of thousands of leaflets, fluttering through the gray sky and settling across the ruins like a false snow. Each leaflet offered mercy. Surrender now and live. They promised food, medical care for the wounded, and eventual repatriation to Germany after the war. For men who had been eating snow and sawdust, it sounded like salvation. But the order from Hitler was absolute. No surrender. Paulus, ever the obedient soldier, passed that order down. And so, the fighting dragged on, pointless, hopeless, brutal. The men knew the truth. The war for Stalingrad was already lost. What remained was survival or madness. In the ruins, discipline dissolved. Soldiers turned on each other. Some deserted. Some ended their own lives. Others, driven by rage and despair, hunted down their own officers, men who had bullied or beaten them when the 6th Army was still strong. A driver from the 16th Panzer Division, Jan Schintz, later recalled how his unit executed a hated officer, saying coldly, he was worth more dead than alive. Then came the final blow. On January 15th, the Soviets overran Potomnik Airfield, the vital artery that had kept the army barely alive. Soon after, they captured Gumrak, the last airstrip still in German hands. Paulus watched helplessly as his last hope for resupply vanished beneath Soviet artillery. The Luftwaffe tried to respond, constructing a makeshift strip at Krasny Oktyabr in just 2 days. But it was a fantasy. A field of shattered ice under constant fire, their remaining aircraft, mostly Ju-52 transports and converted He-111 bombers, were falling from the sky almost as quickly as they could land. On January 20th alone, 6 crashed inside the pocket, bursting into flames upon impact. Paulus, who had once commanded one of the most formidable armies in history, could only watch the slow, methodical death of his men. He wrote bitterly in his notes, "When the aircraft do not land, it means the death of the army." By mid-January, fewer than 100,000 soldiers were still capable of holding a rifle. The rest lay dead, frostbitten, or delirious from hunger and typhus. At 12:20 p.m. on January 22, 1943, the last Junkers Ju-52 transport touched down on the frozen ground of Stalingrad and took off again with a handful of wounded, the final souls to escape the encirclement. The following day, the final Heinkel 111 evacuation flights clawed their way into the sky and disappeared westward. Then, silence. The airlift, the desperate miracle that had tried to keep 250,000 men alive, was over. And with its end, so too ended any illusion that Stalingrad could be saved. All that remained now for Paulus and his dying army was the inevitable. The Luftwaffe kept flying, desperate, determined, but doomed. Through blizzards and Soviet fire, they dropped whatever supplies they could into the Stalingrad pocket. Yet, what reached the trapped soldiers was a mere fraction of what they needed. Over 2.5 months, the airlift meant to deliver at least 500 tons a day, managed an average of only 114.6 tons, at the catastrophic cost of 466 aircraft. By January 26th, the situation had reached its breaking point. A massive Soviet assault sliced the pocket clean in two, severing any remaining lines of communication. Still, in his distant headquarters, Hitler refused to accept reality, convinced that the Sixth Army could somehow defy annihilation. Then came the final act of absurdity. On January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of his rise to power, Hitler promoted Friedrich Paulus to Field Marshal, the highest rank in the German army. No German field marshal, Hitler reminded him, had ever been captured alive. It was not a promotion. It was an instruction, a demand for suicide, wrapped in flattery Paulus understood. He reportedly turned to his staff and said bitterly, I have no intention of shooting myself for this Bohemian corporal. By then, the Sixth Army had ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. Some German officers, recognizing the futility, deliberately expended their ammunition so that surrender would be their only option. Starving, frozen, and surrounded, Paulus's headquarters itself was soon overrun. At midday on January 31st, 1943, the once proud Field Marshal of the Sixth Army was taken prisoner. 2 days later, on February 2nd, the last remnants of organized resistance in Stalingrad laid down their arms. The greatest and bloodiest battle of the Second World War was over. Of the 265,000 German and Axis troops trapped in the Stalingrad pocket, only 91,000 remained alive to surrender gaunt, frost-bitten shadows of men. Of those, barely 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The rest perished in Soviet captivity, claimed by starvation, disease, and the cold. Even after the surrender, small groups of Germans, including Soviet POWs who had fought for the Wehrmacht, hid among the ruins for months, hunted down one by one. Few survived. The numbers are almost beyond comprehension. Historians estimate that the Battle of Stalingrad claimed around 2 million casualties in total, soldiers and civilians alike, making it one of the bloodiest battles in all of human history. Field Marshal Paulus remained in Soviet hands until 1953. When he was finally released, he returned not to Hitler's Germany, but to a divided nation to the east, where he lived out his days as a quiet and broken man. For both sides, Stalingrad was no longer just a city. It was the very embodiment of the Eastern Front, a war of annihilation where mercy did not exist. For Germany, it was the turning point, the moment the dream of a 1,000-year Reich began to crumble. For Stalin, it was vindication proof that the Red Army could stand, fight, and win. And when the end finally came 2 years later, it was not a swastika flying over Stalingrad's ruins, but the hammer and sickle waving over the shattered remains of Berlin.